3 days after my parents' funeral, my sister stood in front of me, dropped moving boxes at my feet, and told me to find somewhere else to die. I was still walking with a cane, still trying to rebuild my life after the accident that nearly killed me. But what she didn't know was this: my parents had seen everything, and they had left behind a truth powerful enough to change everything. My name is Sierra Thompson, and I was 34 years old when my own sister stood in the doorway, looked me in the eye, and coldly told me to find somewhere else to die. It was 3 days after our parents' funeral. The flowers on their graves had not even begun to wilt. I was still using a cane after the car accident that had nearly taken my life 2 years earlier. And yet Victoria did not hesitate. She brought moving boxes. She brought her husband, and she brought a kind of cruelty I had never imagined could live inside someone who shared my blood. I stood in the living room of the only home I had left. The house where I grew up. The place where I had spent the last 2 years recovering and caring for our parents in the final stretch of their lives. But in Victoria's eyes, I was nothing. A burden. A parasite. A useless woman taking up space that no longer belonged to me. What hurt most was not only the words themselves, but the way she said them as though they were the most natural thing in the world. Not a tear. Not a pause. As if I were not her sister. Only a problem she needed, removed as quickly as possible. At that moment, I had no idea that 3 days later, inside a lawyer's office, everything would be turned upside down. I only knew that my heart felt crushed. My parents were gone. I had not even learned how to breathe inside that grief yet, and now the only family I had left was the one person who wanted to throw me out into the cold. 2 years before my parents died, my life looked completely different. I was a landscape architect, running my own small firm in Hartford. I designed gardens for wealthy clients, restored grounds for historic estates, and had just landed a major contract with the city's botanical society. Everything was moving in the right direction. I had work I loved, projects that challenged me, mornings full of purpose, and evenings where I felt exhausted but fulfilled. My life was not perfect, but it made sense. Then, in a matter of seconds, it all disappeared. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into my car. I do not remember the impact. I only remember waking up in a hospital room with the sharp smell of antiseptic, blinding white lights above me, and doctors telling me my spine had been severely damaged. There were metal rods in my back. The surgery had lasted 11 hours. Recovery could take years. I still remember exactly how it felt when they told me I might never walk again. That sentence did not just threaten my legs. It threatened the entire future I had spent years building. The stairs in my apartment suddenly became impossible. The projects waiting on my desk no longer had an owner. My savings, which had once felt responsible and safe, became nothing more than a countdown against the endless appetite of medical bills. In a short time, I went from being an independent woman with a career and direction to someone forced to relearn how to exist inside a body that no longer obeyed her. When my parents offered me the first-floor guest room in their house, I accepted, even though shame sat heavily in my chest. It was the house where I had grown up. The same home that still had my high school track trophies gathering dust on a shelf. The place that had watched me become an adult and then leave to build a life of my own. Now I was coming back not as a daughter visiting home, but as someone life had knocked completely flat. For the first 18 months, I used a wheelchair. I learned how to maneuver through narrow doorways, how to get into the bathroom without falling, how to endure the humiliation of needing help with things I had done alone since I was barely out of childhood. There were days when I felt like I had disappeared, as if the person I used to be had been erased, and all that remained was pain, slowness, and dependence. But my parents never treated me like I was broken beyond repair. My mother read to me on the bad days when pain made concentration impossible. My father built a ramp at the back porch so I could sit outside and look at the garden. They did not pity me. They stayed beside me. Meanwhile, the rest of the world kept moving. My business closed. My clients moved on. The money disappeared into treatment, prescriptions, and therapy sessions. But inside that house, even when I felt reduced to pieces, there was still a place for me to rest, breathe, and slowly gather myself back together. It was not the life I had planned, but it was the one I had. And my parents made sure I never faced it alone. During all the time I lived with my parents to recover, the people who truly showed up for me were them, not Victoria. My sister called maybe once a month, sometimes even less. And whenever I answered the phone, her response was usually the same. "You're still there, put mom on." The words always landed like an insult rather than a question, as though my presence in that house was something embarrassing, inconvenient, and impossible to scrub away. Victoria never asked how physical therapy was going. She never asked whether my back still hurt. She never asked how I was managing after losing my business, my independence, and nearly everything that had once made up my identity. Maybe in her mind, I was no longer a whole person. Maybe I had become a symbol of failure, a reminder that life could become ugly and inconvenient. And that did not fit the polished image she wanted for herself. The longer I stayed in that house, the more I realized the distance between us had not started with my accident. The accident had only exposed it. My mother still hoped we might become closer someday. My father always tried to defend both daughters equally, as if time might soften whatever had hardened inside Victoria. But I had felt that coldness in her for years. Before, I had been too busy with my own life to really name it. Once the accident stripped everything down, I could not pretend anymore. I saw clearly that the sister I might once have leaned on in a crisis had long since stopped seeing me as family in the way that mattered. What Victoria did not know, or more truthfully, what she had never cared enough to ask, was that 4 months before our parents died, I had started walking again. First with a walker, then with a cane. For most people, taking a step is ordinary. For me, each step was a victory purchased with pain, tears, and a kind of stubborn determination that left me shaking. I still remember the first time I made it from my bed to the window without falling. I cried. Not because it hurt, but because my body had finally returned a small piece of freedom to me. I was healing. I was getting stronger. I was trying to build my life back 1 inch at a time. But in Victoria's mind, I would always be the useless one. Maybe she needed me to stay weak so she could keep feeling superior. Maybe she had grown too comfortable seeing me as the lesser daughter. And because of that, she never noticed that I had changed. I was no longer the woman trapped in a wheelchair and completely dependent on everyone around her. I still hurt. I still struggled. But I was standing again. Literally and emotionally. If you have ever gone through a season where people only saw your weakness while you were quietly fighting every day to rise again. Comment en? I understand that feeling more deeply than I wish I did. Sometimes the most painful part is not the injury itself, but the fact that the people closest to you never bothered to see your effort. But I kept moving forward anyway, because I knew that one day, I would not need anyone else's recognition to know my own worth. The last Christmas before my parents died, Victoria came home with her picture-perfect family. Derek wore an expensive cashmere coat, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly medical bills. Their 2 children, Emma and Jack, raced through the house as if they already owned it. And Victoria entered with the energy of a director stepping onto a stage, rearranging things, criticizing details, reminding everyone how things should be done properly. She commented on my mother's table settings, shifted decorations, and adjusted the room according to her own taste, without asking a single person what they wanted. I spent 3 full days making her children's favorite meals: homemade macaroni and cheese for Jack, chocolate chip pancakes for Emma. I stood at the stove with my cane propped nearby, my back screaming after 20 minutes. But I kept going. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to be useful. I wanted, at least inside my own home, not to feel like dead weight. My parents noticed. My mother looked at me with that mixture of sadness and pride that only mothers can hold at once. My father quietly lifted the heavier dishes whenever he saw my hands start to tremble. But Victoria seemed blind to all of it. She did not see the effort, only the image she wanted to create. To her, Christmas was not about warmth or reunion. It was a performance, and family only mattered if it fit the script she had written in her head. I felt uneasy all through that visit, though I kept telling myself to stay calm, to be patient, not to start anything. I had no idea that this visit, of all things, would become the moment that made my parents finally see everything clearly enough to change our future. On Christmas morning, we all gathered in the living room for the annual family photo. My father set up the tripod. My mother adjusted the ornaments on the tree. The kids argued over who got to stand in front. I stood nearby with my cane, doing my best to balance and smile. Then Victoria turned toward me and gave me a smile that carried no warmth at all. "Sierra, maybe you should sit this one out," she said. "We want a nice photo for the Christmas card." The room fell silent. My mother opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it again. My father stared at the camera like he could not believe what he had just heard. Victoria added with a shrug, her voice light and casual, "The wheelchair doesn't really fit the aesthetic. You know, the cruelest part was that I was not even in the wheelchair anymore. I was standing there with a cane, but she did not see me as someone recovering. She saw me as something visually inconvenient." I did not argue. I had learned long ago that arguing with Victoria only gave her more power. So I smiled, nodded, and walked into the kitchen. From the small window, I watched my family line up in front of the tree. I heard the camera click once, then twice, then a third time. There they were, my parents, my sister, her husband, their children, everyone except me. I stood in the kitchen with one hand braced against the counter to stop myself from shaking, swallowing the familiar feeling of being erased from my own family. At the time, I did not know my father had seen the whole thing, and I definitely did not know that the very next morning, he would do something that would change everything. My parents died on a Tuesday in March. They were flying to California for an old college friend's wedding. It was a private charter with 6 passengers on board. The skies were clear. There had been no reason to worry. Then the plane went down somewhere over Nevada. They said it was mechanical failure. They said it was quick. But there is no explanation gentle enough to soften the shock of losing the 2 most important people in your life in a phone call that lasts less than a minute. When the call came, I was outside in the garden, pruning the rose bushes my mother had planted 15 years earlier. I still remember the smell of crushed leaves on my hands, the sunlight across the stone path, and the vibration of my phone in my pocket. 30 seconds later, my whole world had collapsed. I do not remember lowering myself down. I only remember the feeling that all sound had been sucked out of the air, leaving behind a giant emptiness. Victoria flew in for the funeral and immediately took over everything: the flowers, the guest list, the arrangements, the speeches. I was too numb to fight her. At the service, I sat in the front pew and realized I did not recognize half the people in attendance. Victoria's friends, Victoria's connections, people who had never really known my parents but wanted to be seen honoring them. I could barely feel anything except emptiness. I had not even had time to cry properly. Not really. I had not begun to understand what had happened. And already, Victoria's need to manage, control, and perform had filled every available space around grief. 3 days after we buried my parents, Victoria said she needed to speak with me privately. She found me in the living room, surrounded by sympathy cards I still could not bring myself to open. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed while Derek lingered behind her like a shadow. Then she said, in the calmest voice imaginable, I spoke to the lawyer. Everything goes to me. The house. The accounts. All of it. I looked up at her and felt something cold settle into my stomach. What lawyer? I asked. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. The lawyer. Mom and Dad's estate attorney. No name. No office. No documents. Just the lawyer. And in that exact moment, something inside me started waking up. My parents had worked with Harold Whitmore for more than 20 years. If Victoria had truly spoken with him, she would have said his name. But she did not. When I asked if she had paperwork, a copy of the will, anything in writing, she gave the slightest twitch around her eye and said she did not need to show me anything. She said I had 2 weeks to move out. I looked at her, and for the first time since the funeral, what I felt was not just grief, it was suspicion. Grief had numbed me. Lies made me alert. That night I sat alone in my father's study, surrounded by everything he and my mother had left behind. And I asked myself one question over and over: was Victoria bluffing? And if she was, why was she in such a hurry to push me out? If she was lying, then maybe the truth was the only thing I had left to hold on to. That night, I sat in my father's study and took stock of my life as if I were standing in the wreckage after a storm. I had no job. My firm had closed 18 months earlier when medical bills made it impossible to keep anything running. I had no savings. What little I had was swallowed by copays, specialists, prescriptions, and the endless pain management my spine demanded. My only income was disability, and it barely covered the basics. And now, if Victoria was telling the truth, I would soon have no home either. I looked around the room, my father's desk, worn smooth by decades of work. My mother's reading chair faded, where her head always rested. The window looking out over the garden we had built together. Her planting. Me designing. This house was not just shelter. It was memory. Childhood. First steps. Family dinners. Arguments with my father. Cooking lessons with my mother. If I walked away, I would not just lose a roof. I would lose my parents all over again. Worse, I would be accepting Victoria's version of me. The useless one. The one who did not deserve to stay. The one worth nothing. I could not accept that. I would not. So I began opening drawers, searching for anything that might point me toward the truth. And while you're here with me in this part of the story, take a second to like the video if this moment hits home. Sometimes one small gesture helps stories about dignity and boundaries reach the person who needs them most. It was right then, in the bottom drawer of my father's desk, beneath old tax papers and faded photographs, that my fingers closed around something that made my heart start pounding. It was a business card. Harold Whitmore, estate attorney. I turned it over and saw my father's familiar handwriting on the back. Call him. He knows everything. I froze with the card in my hand. My father was not the kind of man who left cryptic little messages lying around. He was direct, practical, and deeply impatient with drama. So seeing those 6 words written in his careful hand felt almost surreal. As though he had known this exact moment would come. I sank into his chair, the card trembling slightly between my fingers. The first thing I felt was not hope. It was grief so sharp it almost folded me in half. Even gone, my father had still tried to leave me a path. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Victoria refusing to say Harold's name. I kept replaying the speed with which she had tried to force me out. And I kept looking at my father's note like it was a hand reaching across death to steady me. In the days since the funeral, I had been so swallowed by pain that I had started to believe maybe I really was powerless. But that small card pulled me back. It reminded me that my parents knew me better than I gave them credit for. And perhaps they knew Victoria better than any of us had wanted to admit. I slipped the card into my pocket and kept it close to my chest, like a piece of courage I could physically carry. I did not know what Harold Whitmore was going to say. I did not know whether anything could save me. But for the first time since the funeral, I had a clear purpose. 3 days later, while I was in the living room practicing a few careful steps without my cane, because my physical therapist said I was finally ready to try, the front door flew open so hard it made me jump. Victoria stormed in carrying cardboard boxes, with Derek following behind her holding more. She dropped them at my feet, the hollow thud echoing through the room. "Pack your things," she said. "You have until Friday." I tried to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "Victoria, I need more time." "I'm still," she cut me off with a sneer. "Still what?" Still pretending to be sick, I stared at her. "I was in a car accident. You know that." She nudged one of the boxes toward me with her foot. "You've milked that long enough." Derek shifted awkwardly and muttered that maybe they should talk about this later. But Victoria would not stop. That was when Rose, the nurse who had cared for my parents in their final months, stepped out from the kitchen. At the same time, Maggie, our longtime neighbor, had just walked in with a casserole. Both of them heard what came next. Victoria took a step closer, close enough for her expensive perfume to hit me like something sharp and artificial. Then she looked at me like I was garbage that needed to be taken out and said, "Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." The words hung in the room like a blade. Rose made a soft sound of shock. Maggie put a hand to her chest. I just stood there, ice cold from the inside out. That was no longer a cruel thing said in anger. It was a revelation. It was the clearest truth Victoria had ever spoken about how she really saw me. I was still reeling from what she had said when Maggie moved first. She was in her 70s. Not a large woman. But in that moment she carried the force of someone protecting her own blood. Maggie had known my mother since before I was born. She had held me as a baby, watched both Thompson girls grow up, and she had clearly decided silence was no longer an option. She looked directly at Victoria and said her full name in a voice sharp enough to slice glass. "Victoria Eileen Thompson. Your mother would roll in her grave if she heard you right now." Victoria turned slowly, her face arranged into that polished, condescending calm she wore like jewelry, and asked who had invited Maggie into a family matter. Maggie did not step back. She told Victoria she had been family in the truest sense, long before Victoria understood what that word meant. Then she moved to stand beside me, one hand resting on my arm like an anchor. That was when I noticed Rose quietly slip a small notebook from her pocket and write something down. Fast and discreet, like she was recording a patient's vital signs. I did not understand it then, but later I would realize she was documenting exactly what had happened. Victoria tried to cling to authority, insisting our mother had left her in charge. Maggie replied in a calm, final tone, "Your mother didn't leave you in charge of anything." Not yet. The entire room fell silent. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Victoria's face. She finally grabbed Derek and threw one last threat over her shoulder that I had until Friday before storming out. When the door slammed shut, Maggie squeezed my arm and said, "Don't you worry. Honey, this isn't over." I wanted to believe her, but in that moment, I still felt like I was standing in the middle of the ashes of my life. The next morning, Derek came back alone. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had lost a fight with his own conscience. The first thing he said was that Victoria did not know he was there and that he needed to talk to me. I let him in. We sat in the living room. Him perched on the edge of my mother's chair. Me on the couch with my cane resting against the arm. He would not meet my eyes. Finally, he started saying that what happened the day before was not personal. That Victoria was under a lot of pressure. I asked him what kind of pressure made someone tell her disabled sister to get out of her dead parents' house. He flinched like the truth had hit him. Then he let something slip: they really needed the money. When I kept pressing, he finally admitted it. His investments from the previous year had collapsed, and they were about $400,000 in debt. The bank was threatening to take their house. The kids' tuition for next semester was already becoming a problem. All that polished perfection Victoria wore so carefully was not stability at all. It was panic in designer packaging. I sat completely still as the pieces began falling into place. Victoria was not just cruel, she was desperate. And in that desperation, she was willing to treat my parents' home, their savings, and even my pain as tools to save herself. Derek had barely said enough when Victoria's voice sliced in from the doorway. She dragged him out before he could explain any more. As she pulled him away, he mouthed something at me. I could not tell whether it was sorry or help. But by then, it hardly mattered. I understood exactly why they needed me gone. It was never because I was worthless. It was because they needed what they thought they could take. That night, I took out Harold Whitmore's business card again and stared at my father's handwriting as if it might glow under the desk lamp. Call him. He knows everything. I drew in a breath and dialed before I could lose my nerve. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered. As soon as I introduced myself as Sierra Thompson, daughter of Robert and Eleanor Thompson, Harold's voice softened. He told me he had been expecting my call. Just hearing that made my fingers tighten around the phone. I told him Victoria claimed she had already met with him, and that he had confirmed the entire estate belonged to her. Harold gave a dry little laugh and said he had not spoken to Victoria since my parents' anniversary party 3 years earlier. She had never contacted his office. Relief hit me so hard it made me dizzy. Victoria had lied. But the truth was even bigger than that. Harold explained that my parents had been extremely specific about their wishes. So specific that he wanted me to come in before the official reading because there were details that needed context. Details no one else knew. Not even Victoria. Then he said something that nearly stopped my breath. My father had changed the will 6 months earlier. Right after Christmas. Right after the family photo without me. So he had seen. He had understood. He had refused to let that silence become the final statement about my worth. By the time I hung up, my hand was still trembling. But now it was from something other than fear. Hope had entered the room for the first time since the funeral. My parents had prepared for this. They knew what Victoria might do. And somehow, even after death, they were still trying to protect me. The day before the official will reading, Rose came by to say goodbye. She stood on the porch wrapped in a cardigan, looking smaller than I remembered. For 8 months, she had been a steady presence in this house, checking my parents' vitals, managing their medications, sitting with my mother through long nights when pain kept her awake. Now her work with us was over, and she was moving on to another family, another patient, another ending. But before she left, she said she had something for me. She reached into her bag and took out a worn, leather-bound notebook. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. Rose placed it in my hands and told me my mother had asked her to keep it safe until I needed it. Then Rose lowered her voice and said the last few pages were about me and Victoria. I asked if there was anything else, and she hesitated before telling me that my mother had also recorded a video message a few months earlier, with very clear instructions about when it should be played. My throat tightened. I did not understand yet why my mother had prepared both a journal and a video. Why she seemed to have seen so far ahead. Rose simply squeezed my hand and said my parents loved both daughters. But they were not blind. She told me my mother knew what Victoria would do and had prepared for it. After Rose left, I stood alone on the porch with that notebook in my hands. It felt heavy. Like a promise. Like a warning. I was not ready to open it yet. Just touching my mother's handwriting made my chest ache. But I understood more than ever that this was becoming about something much larger than the house or the money. This was about who my parents knew we really were. Victoria organized the memorial reception exactly the way she handled everything else expensive. Polished. And without asking me a single thing. The restaurant was upscale Italian. With cloth napkins. Private dining. And embossed cream invitations featuring my parents' names in gold. By the time I arrived late, because traffic delayed my taxi, and walking with a cane from the parking area took longer than I expected, Victoria was already standing at the head of a long table with a glass of wine in her hand. Speaking to a room of about 40 people, she talked about family, legacy, responsibility, and honoring everything our parents had built. As if she were the rightful heir not only to their estate, but to the entire Thompson name. I stood in the doorway and no one noticed. Then Aunt Dorothy asked where I would be living now. Victoria smiled sweetly and said I was transitioning. As if I were a problem being quietly removed from the frame. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. I stood there clutching my cane, feeling every pair of eyes slide over me, and then away again in discomfort. As Victoria glided past me, she leaned close and whispered that I should have stayed home because I was embarrassing myself. I said nothing. I remembered Harold's advice, let her talk now. Because the silence later would be louder. Then Maggie arrived, dressed in black and carrying righteous anger in every step. She crossed the room and came straight to me. The moment she learned what Victoria had implied, she stood up and exposed her in front of everyone. Maggie said I was the one who had cared for my parents every day, while Victoria sent flowers and performance. The whole room went still. For the first time, I watched the perfect mask Victoria wore begin to crack in front of witnesses. 3 days later, I walked into Harold Whitmore's office on the 12th floor of the Hartford Financial Building. The conference room was lined with dark wood, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victoria was already there, seated at the head of the table like she owned the place. Her Hermes bag was positioned perfectly beside her. Her posture was flawless. Derek sat next to her, jittery and glued to his phone like a man desperate to disappear. I took a seat across from them and leaned my cane against the chair. Harold entered with a court reporter, opened his briefcase, and asked Victoria whether she had ever seen the full version of my parents' will. She answered confidently that she had. That it had been in our mother's nightstand. Harold calmly asked whether she had seen the complete will or merely the summary copy kept for reference. I watched Victoria's smile vanish. Then Harold took out a thick blue-backed legal document and laid it on the table. He explained that this was the actual final will, 32 pages. Executed 6 months earlier. Witnessed. Notarized. And filed with probate. Victoria nearly shot out of her seat, accusing him of fraud. Harold did not raise his voice, but each word landed like a hammer. He had served my family for 22 years, he said, and he would not tolerate that accusation. Then he began to read. Victoria was left a trust worth approximately $14 million, but only as a managed trust. She could withdraw $50,000 per year, with the remainder going to her children when they turned 30. Derek looked like all the air had left his body. Victoria went pale. Then came the part about the house. I almost stopped breathing as Harold read that the family home and surrounding property were being left to me. Sierra Ann Thompson. On the condition that it could not be sold for 10 years. I was still trying to process the will when Harold said there was one more thing. He took a USB drive from his briefcase and explained that my parents had recorded a video message and had insisted it be played during the reading. The screen lit up. And there they were. My mother sat in her favorite chair by the living room window. My father stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder. They looked tired. But they also looked clear-eyed and certain. My mother spoke first. She said that if we were watching this, then they were gone. And things had unfolded exactly the way they had feared. Then my father looked directly at the camera and addressed Victoria by name. He said they had loved her from the moment she was born. But love did not mean blindness. They had seen the way she treated me. The way she dismissed me. Diminished me. And pushed me aside. My mother turned to speak to me and said I was not useless. That I had never been useless. She called me the quiet strength of the family. The one who stayed. The one who cared. The one who showed up. Then my father explained that they had changed the will after Christmas. After watching Victoria exclude me from the family photo. After hearing her tell my mother that I was dragging the family down. He said they were not going to let their deaths become yet another way for me to be erased. I was crying before the video even ended. Not because of the house. Not because I had somehow won against Victoria, but because, at last, I heard my parents say out loud what I had always been afraid they had never fully seen in me. They had seen me. They had known. They had protected me. And the moment the screen went dark, I heard Victoria's chair scrape violently as she stood and walked out without a word. I found Victoria in the hallway after the reading. She was leaning against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself. Mascara streaked down her face. Derek stood nearby, whispering urgently into his phone. Probably to the bank or some creditor circling their lives like sharks. When Victoria saw me, the first thing she said was that it was not fair. That I did not understand she had a family. Children. Responsibilities. I looked at her and reminded her that she also had a sister. The sister she had told to find somewhere else to die. She flinched. But I did not stop. I told her quietly that she was right about one thing. I did not have a husband. I did not have children. I did not have the things she believed made a person valuable. But I had also not spent years treating my own sister like garbage. I told her I was not going to humiliate her in return, because that was not who my parents had raised me to be. But I was going to set a boundary. From that point on, she would never speak to me that way again. Not in private. Not in public. Not in front of her children. Then, I made her an offer. I said I was willing to loan her the money she needed to save her house. With no interest and reasonable terms. But in return, she would have to apologize to me publicly at a family dinner, in front of everyone who had attended the memorial reception. Victoria said nothing. She walked away. I returned to the conference room. Signed the final documents. Accepted the letter my mother had left just for me. And walked out with the deed to my childhood home, pressed against my chest. In the months that followed, I kept up physical therapy. Gradually stopped needing the cane. Returned to work part-time. Read my mother's journal. And began to understand that I had never been useless the way other people claimed. I had only needed to learn how to believe that myself. I had not found somewhere else to die. I had found my way back home to live. If Sierra's story reminded you that your worth is not defined by how other people see you, leave a comment with the words, "Boundaries matter." And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video.